Okay, great. Welcome everyone who's joining. We're really glad to have you here. My name is Rebecca. I'm the events director for Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally, or ESAL, which is one of the sponsors of this event. So Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally is a 501c3 organization. It's all volunteer run, and it was founded with the mission to empower people with STEM backgrounds to engage with their local communities. And so we have a lot of different aspects of the organization. We have a blog series that highlights various people and issues that are at the intersection of local policy and science. We have a really great resources page with sort of playbooks and step-by-step directions on different ways that you can engage with your local community and local government. And then we also host a lot of events like these, online webinars with really excellent panelists, and I'm especially excited for the event we have today. We are lucky to have two other awesome co-sponsors, the National Science Policy Network, and as well as the Federation of American Scientists. And Mike, if you want to say a couple words.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm Mike Fisher. I'm at the Federation of American Scientists. We're really happy to be one of the partners putting these events forward. We're a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. that focuses on both national security and science and technology policy. One of the projects that I help work on is asking the science community to input nonpartisan informational resources into congressional hearings. And so if you're interested in finding out more about that and becoming involved, you can go to fas.org/Congress. Again, we're really happy to be a part of this, and I'm excited to hear from the panelists. And I guess I'll just turn it back over to Rachel.
I'll actually introduce Rachel really quickly. Rachel has really been the driving force behind putting together this excellent panel. So Dr. Rachel Burkhart is a microbiologist who helps connect scientists to the latest research about COVID-19 through her work at the American Society for Microbiology. And she's also an ESAL volunteer for the communications team. So Rachel, over to you.
Great, thanks Rebecca, and thanks for everyone for tuning in today to our COVID conversations. This is the second of our two-part series, all about science communication. So before, in our first event, we were talking about science communication and doing that within your community, especially with family and friends. And some of the big takeaways we learned were to try to make sure that as scientists, we're really accessible, that we're open to people asking us questions, and then also that it's really important for us to build trust within communities and within our families and friends to show that we are knowledgeable about something, but also to be very open and honest about what we do know about COVID-19 and what we don't. So there's a certain kind of, set to talk with your family and friends, but that's going to be slightly different how you communicate with your local legislator. And so today we have three amazing panelists who are going to talk us and give us a little bit of advice about how to talk and communicate science when you're talking with your local government. So for our panelists, we have Dr. Gulhane Kufr, who is the Senior Director of Policy at Public Health Advocates. We have Dr. Vanessa Fry, who is the Interim Director of the Idaho Policy Institute. And we have Flavia Tejeda, who is a PhD candidate and part of the Puerto Rico Policy Action Network. So today, all three of them are going to share a little bit about their journey of being involved in science communication and science policy, and just kind of talk about what tips that we can learn to not only speak about COVID-19 with our legislator, but also talk about science in general with our local government. So Flavia, if you want to do a quick little introduction of yourself, that'd be great.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I am a PhD candidate, as Rachel said, in cell and molecular biology at Universidad Central del Caribe in Puerto Rico. I am also part of the Puerto Rico Science Policy Action Network, where we try to engage scientists with the local government, as today's conversation will be. And when I'm not in the lab or working with PRSPAN, I just like to cook. Rachel, I think you're muted.
Thank you. What I was trying to say is that I love to eat. So you and I would be great friends because I would eat everything you make. Dr. Fry, would you like to do a short introduction about yourself?
Did you say, which one did you say? I'm sorry.
Vanessa.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. Thank you so much, Rachel. It's great to be here with you all. As Rachel mentioned, I'm the interim director of Idaho Policy Institute. We're seated in the School of Public Service at Boise State University. And I helped co-found the Institute in 2016 with the purpose of being an objective research resource for Idaho's decision makers. And we work beyond Idaho as well. But we really saw that there was a lot of lack of ability to access good scientific information in Idaho, and that they needed, in our state, that we needed some sort of opportunity to translate the data that we're doing at the university into usable evidence for decision makers across the state. And so we work on all types of projects. Most recently, we've been engaging with the governor's office on helping people understand COVID-19 data.
Great, thank you. And then Dr. Kofer, if you would like to say a few words about who you are, what you do, and how you got there.
Certainly. So, well, good morning if you're in California, and good afternoon to the rest of you. My name is Flo Kofer, and I am the Senior Director of Policy for Public Health Advocates. And we are an almost 22-year-old policy advocacy organization that works statewide in California and also helps to bolster some of our national efforts related to public health policy. And so part of the way that we do that is what I like to call translational research and advocacy. So we like to take what Dr. Fry and others are working on and figure out how do we explain that to the legislature? How do we explain it to our communities in language that can be understood, which certainly dovetails with the last session and the topics there around, engaging our communities and making sure that they're important stakeholders and that they're involved in not only being the receivers of information, but also being the agenda setters in what we do. And then we take what our community says that they want to do with the information we have, and we actually go and do it. And so for those of you around the country who may have seen calorie labels when you go to certain chain restaurants, that is based on legislation that our organization championed with our partners here in California, which was the basis for that. We work a lot with the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Center for Science in the Public Interest and others at the national level to be able to take some of the things we're learning locally and apply them elsewhere. We also have worked on things like diabetes prevention. We were the first state in the nation to be able to have the diabetes prevention program, which is an evidence-based program for people at risk of diabetes, to actually be covered by almost all of our state plans, Medi-Cal included, which is our state Medicaid plan. And so those are the kinds of things that we are always championing, is how can we do things in a way that serves our community? How do we center equity, in particular racial equity and socioeconomic equity as a cornerstone of the work that we're doing? And a lot of that has to do with how we engage legislators and the topic of this conversation today. So thank you so much for having me and for putting this on. I'm really excited about the conversation.
Well, thank you for being here. I think we're going to have a really great discussion, and I'm hoping to learn a lot. And I think to kick it off, I'd like to ask Flavia first, why is science communication important? And I think this comes from maybe more the scientists who are maybe in grad school doing a postdoc, who are saying, my job is to do research, get grants, they're echoing maybe some of their PIs. Why is it important to know how to communicate science, and why is it important to know how to communicate science with your local government?
So when we start grad school, when we go to grad school sometimes, and I speak for myself, science communication was all about articles, right? How do I do my research, and how do I write an article that gets peer reviewed and then further along published? So that was basically the goal when I thought about science communication at first. But I mean, what is science if we cannot translate it to the community? So what is that we do in the bench that it's so important that we cannot be able to communicate in a simple way to the community? And science communication for a long time was thought to be one direction. So scientists speaking to public or non-scientists, right? But as science communication has evolved, we know that science communication is that it's dynamic. So it does not only feed from the expert, the scientist in this particular topic, but it also feeds from the community, from the non-scientists. So it's a dialogue between scientists, non-scientists, and other people involved, as today's conversation, policymakers. So science communication, it's very dynamic. It helps in bridging, let's say, for example, the data for COVID, and just using this as an example. So the jargon, the scientific jargon, how do we translate? How do we communicate to people in a way that they can understand? Because that's the purpose. So we want society to benefit from science. We have to make science accessible to society. And we have to take into consideration not only that we're talking to non-scientists, but the context of these people, the community. What is it important for them? Why is this topic in particular so important to them? And we have to translate that into a way that they can understand and that can actually apply the science to it and take action for science.
No, that's so well said. And I think that's so important. At ESOL, we're all about engaging local and looking at what the needs of the community are and actually trying to use our, our scientific, our STEM backgrounds and actually make a difference. And I wonder, Vanessa, if you could talk a little bit about why it's so important to have, scientific voices coming to the table, and maybe a couple ideas of examples or ideas for how people to do that and start small, even if they're maybe not a virologist talking about COVID-19.
Definitely, and I can't agree more with what Flavia said. She said, she was speaking from her perspective as a, someone that's finishing up her degree, but I think it really translates to all of us that are working in science, right? That engagement that we desire to have with the community and develop clear communication strategies that aren't just one way, that are back and forth. My background prior to, so my PhD is in public policy administration, but my undergrad was biology. And so that I come at what I do with a little bit of a background on the biophysical science side of things, which I think really helps me think about understand the technology and the biophysical science behind some of what we're doing. But then my public policy administration education really helps me figure out how to, how is it impactful for those decision makers? And so it's kind of nice to have that background. And so I always think that when I am working with a particular project with the legislature, for example, if I don't have a background in a certain area of expertise, I make sure that I bring someone else along with me when we go to sit with the Board of Education, for example, to make sure that we're fully able to engage in a conversation where we have a good language, or we're using shared language. So that's one thing, is always looking, even if you're not the expert, who's that someone that I can bring along with me, I think is really important. And again, coming with the idea of really understanding the needs of, and I'll again use the legislature as an example. So what are they really wanting to know about this program? Or what are they really wanting to know about the occurrences of COVID-19 across the state of Idaho? And actually, how are they going to use the data in the long run, which helps us think about what's the best way to communicate it. We've gone away from, at Idaho Policy Institute, from doing a lot of static reporting to more dynamic reporting, which is really helpful too, because rather than just being a snapshot in time, we have more interactive dashboards, for example. And so we've done that with case reporting here at Boise State, and then as it relates to the counties that are in the Metro Boise region, which helps the legislature take a look at what are the policies that need to be in place locally or more broadly across the state when it comes to COVID-19. I think also understanding who the broader audience is, even besides the policymakers, are they ultimately going to go and take that to their constituency? And then can we have an understanding of what's going to be helpful to communicate with them? And so recently, the Idaho governor, Brad Little, he kept on speaking at these press conferences like all of our governors have been. And he would say what our daily case rate is. And then, a couple minutes later, someone would tweet that his numbers are wrong. And he's like, how are my numbers are wrong? I'm pulling, and so he came to us and he said, is there a way for you to help us understand why all these different reporting outlets have different numbers? And so we recently created a fact sheet that's just a 2-pager that he can have, and he can actually share with press too, to show at different times when the reporting's happening and where the discrepancies may be. And so that was really helpful. He's probably not going to distribute that, but that's helpful, like broadly, right? But it's helpful for him to share with those reporters or those people that have questions about why the data looks different and how he actually is using the best data for the state because it's our locally created data.
Well, that's such a good point. Thinking really not only about, what's the legislature going to do, want, but what are they going to eventually do with it? And thinking, a couple steps ahead, which people with backgrounds in STEM are really good at. We plan research, we know how to think about these things. And so it's a really good idea to just transfer what we're already doing maybe in the lab to having these conversations with, local representatives. And Flo, I'd like to talk about going maybe to something that you've spent a lot of time on. I know you've worked a ton on public health equity, and I'm really wondering if you could talk a little bit about COVID-19 and what challenges and opportunities did COVID-19 really present, and how can people who have backgrounds in STEM also help working with their local government to promote better health equity in this country?
Sure, that's a really great question, and one that I think we've all been wrestling with over the past year, certainly. So my background is I'm an epidemiologist, and so that is my graduate degree. My undergrad is in chemistry and women's studies. So I even when I'm thinking about public policy, I'm always thinking about what do we know and what are we going to do. And so one of the things that immediately came up, actually, I think we probably had some of the earliest schools in my area within California in Elk Grove that shut down early. And my first question, literally the first thing that crossed my brain was, what's going to happen to all of the kids who rely on school as their only meal during the day, right? Because during the summer, we have meal programs set up, but when you just, on a Sunday decide you're going to shut down school for the next week or two, and that was what we thought it was going to be at the time, the questions, remain on how are we going to fill in these gaps, especially with an infectious disease going around? And those are very public health questions, right? And so I think part of what the pandemic has demonstrated for us is that all of the things that we're dealing with now, right? Housing and, and the impact on the education system, all of those things were already happening prior to the pandemic. And all the pandemic did was make an existing situation worse by layering an infectious disease that is quite deadly on top of the foundation that was already inequitable. So what we're seeing is that people who are largely our lower wage workers were both designated essential and also offered very little in the way of protection, right? So we're talking about, our food service workers and those in our food service, or our food distribution pipeline, right, are required to show up to work in person and weren't in the early days given PPE. And we're not given, the appropriate supports in terms of time off and in terms of, well, what do you do if somebody in your household is infected and you have to quarantine and all of those kinds of things. And so what it brings up for me is the need for us to not just think about putting data out. And I think Dr. Fry, and Flavia talked about this, not just putting data out and hoping that somebody picks it up and does the right thing with it. But one of the things that I'm always encouraging scientists to do is to consider your discussion section. And what I mean by that is even when you're doing peer-reviewed research, even when you're putting things out for the community of other scientists that need to do something with it, think about who else might pick this up. Think about what other places you could consider putting, using your writing. We need people to write op-eds. We need people to explain what you've done in plain language and to actually take that discussion section and that last final part where you talk about future implications and turn that into the message. Because as great as your data are, if they end up in the hands of people who aren't sure what to do with them, it becomes really challenging for the right things to happen. Another example is that I really do feel like the scientific community needs to rally around equity. I know sometimes there's this feeling of not wanting to get into what are considered to be sort of the social sciences. And when we start talking about racism and when we start talking about differential impact, we want to stay away from that because as scientists, we're like, we know race is made up, right? This is a construct that only exists sociologically and we're scientists. But it matters because it shapes the patterns that we see. And so we can't do the colorblind, I don't see this, I'm just gonna, focus over here, because what it means is that we are part of a system that's ignoring the underlying issues. And we do have scientific data to show, yes, race doesn't exist, and yet it still matters. And yet these patterns are still showing up time and time again. And so we do need to certainly be a part of that conversation, because what I've said in the medical community is, part of the challenge right now with vaccine, outreach and distribution is that we haven't done a great job of helping people. I think the stat is 77% of Americans are in a position where their health literacy is so low that they may not be able to follow correctly instructions on a medicine label. And so when we're thinking about that, we're now asking them to be virologists and epidemiologists, and experts in things that, that are far beyond what most people understand. And I say that with a great deal of humility because I still don't know what the economy is, and I have 4 degrees. And I'm okay with that, right? Like I don't know anything about my car other than the fact that it operates on a combustion engine. It needs fuel in order to be able to run, and I have to change my oil. Once you start getting into the carburetor, I feel the same way most people feel when you start talking about science or when you start talking about, health and pathophysiology, right? So I say this with a great deal of humility, that is not to look down on anyone who doesn't understand, but we have to recognize that's where people are. And so there is a role that we have to play in terms of being able to meet them, but we also have to acknowledge history, right? The Tuskegee experiment was unearthed almost 50 years ago. And if we had done the work in our existing establishments over the last 50 years, we wouldn't have seen an initial racial disparity in terms of who was willing to get the vaccine, right? It would have been everybody was at the same level of hesitancy because, well, I just don't know. And, this seems really fast and all of the concerns. But instead, that's layered on top of, yes, and I know with great certainty the racial issues that have happened here and the way that my community has been experimented with. I know with great certainty my sister died in childbirth because she went to the hospital 3 times and nobody listened to her. I know with great certainty my cousin, showed up and needed pain medication, and instead he was screened for being, for being opioid seeking, right? Like people, this isn't just historic, it's an ongoing way that our institutions have done wrong by people. And so I think there is a role that scientists need to play in terms of coming together and saying, this is real and it's making our jobs harder, and we all need to commit to doing something about it.
So well said. And I will admit that I was in college before I realized that race had no biological basis. It had been something that just was kind of said so much. And it was actually, a biology class, and we broke things down and we said that race isn't, there's no biology of it. It is more of a social construct, but it's still a very important construct. And I think that really brings into the fact that, for COVID-19, it's not just virologists, it's not just epidemiologists. We need social scientists. We need other types of scientists to be out there talking. And I wonder, Flavia, if you could, talk a little bit about why do you think it's important for these other scientists who aren't virologists to be talking about COVID-19, and how do they do that? What are skills that you gain by having a STEM background that's going to make sure that you have the capabilities to talk about these things and realize these things to your local community and to your local government?
So my background is in cell biology. So usually when people come to me, one of the hurdles that we've had during this pandemic is the misinformation. So we do have a lot of information, but we do not know which one we should be reading or which one is legit. So as a scientist, I go to the papers. So I go to what has been published for the scientific community, what has been peer reviewed, what the pharmaceuticals company have come up with, the data sheets and with the scientific jargon. And what I do is I read and I make like a little summary. So that little summary, you can actually bring it to your local government, usually with staffers are the ones who will receive you, not maybe the policymakers. But you can bring this summary, or you can bring what you read and the sources. It is very important that you bring the sources, the primary sources, so they can actually give you credit for where you were able to translate for them. And we have a background in critical thinking. And as we read, we come up with ideas. It is something we're constantly seeking, the critical thinking. And it's something that we put to work every day. Concepts in biology, it's something that we see every day. So it doesn't really matter which STEM field you are, you do have the skills to read these kind of scientific jargon. There are limits though. For example, as Dr. Kofor was mentioning, I do not know anything about astronomy. So as scientists, it is also important that we know our limits. What do we understand and what we do not understand? But as scientists, usually we have friends who are scientists too. So these are the networks that can help you understand and bring the information not only to the community, but to policymakers about COVID and the latest data, and why is it important to rely on science, specifically in these times, to make the right steps and to move forward into normalcy.
Oh, so true. That it's great to be able, we all have these critical thinking skills and we know how to read peer-reviewed literature, we know where to find it, we know how to use PubMed. So that's a great skill, but it's also, there can be limitations. I do not know anything about astronomy. And so I would know that there are stars in the sky that are very far away, and that's about my limit. But that's okay because I know where to go and get other information. I think that's something that as people with STEM backgrounds, sometimes because we are considered the experts, we don't want to, touch on something when really we do have a lot of great critical thinking skills and background that we can actually empower ourselves to say, yes, I can go and talk to legislators. I do know about these things, or, hey, I know someone who does know these things. Let's work on something together. And Vanessa, I wonder if you have seen, or if you could talk a little bit about how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way scientists and engineers view public outreach and working with science policy? Do you think it's increased it, decreased it? And how do you think the future of science policy will now work with people who are in this post-COVID?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Rachel. And what I've noticed with my colleagues and myself is really trying to identify, what is the role that I want to play, that I'm equipped to play, and that's needed. And so there's a typology I use when I'm talking with my colleagues that haven't had an opportunity to maybe directly engage, and they're trying to figure out, gosh, I feel like I've got this information. How do I engage? And so I always share this typology with them, and it's from this author Pilkey, and the publication was from 2007. But it breaks the scientists into 5 different categories or typologies that they can consider, which one they represent when they want to or not want to communicate science. And so one is just a pure scientist. Just because someone is on the bench all the time and doing basic science doesn't mean they have to, right? They don't have to go out there and communicate. And so if that's not where their comfort zone is, they'd be a pure scientist, and they really kind of insulate themselves from any policymaking. Maybe they pass it on to their colleagues and their colleagues can take it, but they're just, I just want to do my science, which is fine. There's a science arbiter, and that's someone that does the science and will objectively pass it along, but isn't going to engage in any policymaking discussions, right? They want to provide objective information, and they might be there for questions, but they're not going to make a recommendation. They're not going to say, oh, governor, you should do this, or senator, you should do this. They're going to pass along that and allow the decision makers to do it. I probably fall in that category personally when I think about myself. There are scientists that are considered issue advocates. And those are scientists that they have the knowledge, and that knowledge is really a tool that they use to move policy in a certain direction. And we certainly need that, right? Especially in the times of COVID, when we need to have evidence-based decision-making, we need those scientists that can really speak to policymakers about what this evidence means and help them make the best decision and really advocate for the best decision. There are these kind of shady characters that we call, or Pilkey calls, stealth issue advocates. So they're kind of using science to push an agenda, but they're not really clear with you that they're pushing an agenda. So I'm always careful to, if someone appears to be going in that direction, because in my experience, what that does with any decision maker is they lose trust with them right away, right? If they don't come out and say right away, this is where I want you to go with this, but it seems like they're getting pushed, they're unlikely to build the trust they need with the policymakers. And then finally, there's this role of an honest broker, that scientists can really come in and be an honest broker because they have the knowledge and they can actually help broker a conversation between two parties and not necessarily advocate for one or another, but actually just kind of serve as a convening and really an honest third party that has the science and can translate kind of both sides of an issue, but doesn't necessarily take an issue, just helps them convene to maybe a consensus. So I've seen all across the board during COVID where different colleagues of mine fall. And there's a need for all of them, certainly. And so the first step is, helping them identify what they are and then helping them figure out the best way to kind of serve in that role, because we need that whole kind of the whole set of typologies, maybe not the stealth issue advocate as much, but the other ones are really important to consider.
And
oh, that's great.
I was going to say, I really think it's great that you actually laid those out and gave them names, because now I have language for being able to explain what we've been trying not to do with the vaccine outreach, which is the stealth advocacy, right? So, and this is something I think is really important for us to consider. So our organization, we had a lot of conversations about that, and we have taken the approach of, certainly we always want to be supporting science and always want to be protecting communities, but we took that as like, what is our real goal? And our goal is for people to be healthy. And we think that a vaccine could potentially be one of the tools that could help to keep people healthy. But we didn't want to be in a position where we were essentially peddling the vaccine, because we knew that there was a lot of mistrust in communities. And so we have taken the role of being I hate to use the word neutral, but it's the best thing that's coming to my mind right now, but just a neutral source of information. So we won't lie to you and say, oh no, go out. We're not telling you to go and take, the vaccine. We're telling you, here, let us know what your questions are and we want to answer them. So, you're a pregnant or lactating woman, you weren't included in the clinical trials in a meaningful way. And so we can't tell you anything. Mm-hmm. We can point you to what ACOG says about, making the decision on whether or not to get a vaccine. You're an immune compromised person. Again, you weren't included, robustly enough in the original trials to be able to say anything with concrete evidence. Well, why do we only have 2 months of data? Well, that's because that's typically when many of the adverse effects show up, but we don't yet know exactly how long the immunity is going to last in terms of post-vaccine, and that's part of what we're learning. What does an emergency use authorization mean, right? Like, we've really taken the role of answering questions, in part because what we found is that when people have their questions answered, they then feel a greater sense of trust and comfort with moving forward with what is good for them. But we also take informed consent very seriously. And so we don't want to be a stealth operator who people trust, and then we're out telling people things that are beyond what we know. And we really felt like the community needed a place, because it seemed as if everybody was sort of encroaching on them, right? And telling, you need to get this vaccine. We need to get you to trust us. We need you. And it's like, whoa, trust is earned, not forced. It's not coerced. So how do we do this in a way that allows people to have the information and make their own decisions? And I think that's part of what we need to be really honest about, is when we're playing the role of advocate and we have a chief aim, we need to lead with that. And when we're playing the role of, sort of a neutral information source, we need to be clear about that up front. So I always try to say to people, this is the angle we're playing when it comes to the vaccines. I'm not telling you to take one. I'm not telling you not to take one, but I'm happy to answer your questions and give you the science and what we know. And I think Dr. Fry, I'm so appreciative of you giving language to what some of those roles mean, because it will certainly help us to identify where we are and to avoid being a stealth operator in that way.
That's great. And you kind of answered the next question I was already going to be asking you, Flo, was what do you think are the best ways for people with STEM backgrounds to kind of come to partner with you or to partner with local government and actually make some kind of change? Is it to just try to be maybe a neutral source, or what do you think were your suggestions for if you are someone who is a scientist and you want to create a change? What's the best approach to kind of take it, and what should you bring to local representatives and partner organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we need more sources of people who are not pushing vaccine, but are just answering questions about vaccines, so that people can better understand exactly what is and is not happening. What I'm also seeing is people getting the first dose and seemingly feeling like they're protected, and so they're going off and living their lives, right, in a way that doesn't actually line up with with the level of protection they've been conferred from that initial dose. And certainly Johnson & Johnson getting the emergency use authorization over the weekend adds an additional pickle into it, because now there's this third vaccine that's only one dose that does actually seem to have, I think it's 74%, efficacy in terms of asymptomatic transmission, which is something different from the other two. So now we have to figure out, how do we message for, I think there's 4 million vials that are going to be, distributed, and 16 million by the end of the month. And so as that one comes online, we're now having a third vaccine that we're going to have to explain to people how it works. And, mentioning the equity issues, we now, people are saying, well, we're going to try to get that one because it seems to have fewer side effects, doesn't require the deep cold storage, and is only one dose. So that's the vaccine that we're going to try to get to the more rural areas, or that's the vaccine we're going to try to get to people who can't take off work, multiple times to be able to both recover and to have 2 appointments. And that's the one we're going to use for our, people experiencing homelessness. And it's like, so now we have to layer trust on top of this vaccine that, overall only has a 66% efficacy, as compared to the 95 that started. And so I was joking with someone this weekend, like, I wish Johnson & Johnson had come out with their vaccine first, because going from 66 to 95 feels really good for people. Going from 95 to 66, not so much. And if it's only available in certain places, it's going to raise equity issues. So I think what we need right now is for people to get out ahead of this and to explain, what does this new vaccine do? How does it compare to the others? And then I think, from having an actual like advocacy aim, I think we need to be saying in communities, that have trust issues, and rightly so, that we don't just show up with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, but we're actually giving people choice. And I know that means having deep cold storage and cold storage and all of those other issues, but that's worth it to be able to build trust. And so I think that's the human element of it, is that people feel like they trust you more when you stand back and say, the choice is yours. You can have whichever one of these vaccines work best for you, as opposed to, we're going to give you this one because we think this is best for you. That's paternalism. And especially when it's only offered to certain communities, it's going to seem as if it's reinforcing white supremacy.
Yes, I actually had an hour-long conversation all about the different vaccines with my parents this weekend. They were just like, so tell me about this new one. And for my job, I literally read COVID research every day for hours. So I had a good background in it. And a huge thing I made a big point of was the cold chain storage. And they're like, we hadn't even thought about that. And, it was this like hour-long conversation. They're like, wow, I really learned a lot. But I have a relationship with them. They came to my defense. They didn't know what I was talking about, but, they know I do microbiology. And so it's really important that I had that relationship and that we had the time to have that conversation where we could actually talk about those things, but not have it just be like, well, I told you it's good, so you should do that. And so I think building trust and building relationships is really important. And Flavia, if you could talk a little bit about building relationships with your local representatives, because you don't want to just say, hey, I have all this great stuff, show up, talk to an aide, and then never do follow up. You want to really build that relationship, so you see as like the ambassador for science, as that person that they can trust and that they know that they can go back to. So do you have any tips on doing that?
Yeah, so Rachel, as you just mentioned, it's all about the trust, right? Just like your parents this weekend, you want to come to the policymakers, and you want to come to your local government as a person they can trust, that they can trust the data that you're bringing. In our case, for example, in PeerSpan, we are a group of scientists, right? So we were working with one progress that was coming, one legislation, right? And so we came together to see how we could help in building this legislation and how we could track the legislation as it moved forward. For example, in the federal government, you have GovTrack, in which you can track a legislation live and see the stage, the committee, the subcommittees in which this legislation has been addressed. So in order to maintain a local government relationship, you have to come from a place of trust. So you don't have an agenda. These are the facts. So I'm just bringing you the facts so you can take science into consideration when you're trying to push a legislation. And what could this legislation mean to the community? So for example, if you're trying to get toxic waste in a specific place, you can come as a scientist and say, hey, you want to do this, the community is going to be affected. So the water can be affected. The water, the land, they can be affected in several ways, in several manners, and the community is the one who's going to pay for it. So you're bringing awareness to something that maybe they were not paying attention to the toxicology of this waste, but you're bringing your background and you're coming forward with your expertise and building trust as to this is the science behind your legislation. It could be your decision. It will be your decision when you take the vote, but you have to take into consideration the community behind the legislation you're pushing forward. And as a scientist, my role is to bring the awareness of how this community will be affected. So trying to translate the science into how the community can benefit from it, or in this case, it can be damaged by this legislation. So you have to follow up, of course. We actually do the famous one-pagers, which is one document, 1 page long, very straight to the point. So what is the problem? What's the research on this problem and how it can affect the local community? And usually staffers grab these one-pagers, they read it, they may be interested, they may not, but you follow up, and then you follow up and you show up. And when you make the connection, you have to make both a personal and a local connection, right? Because I mean, I am Puerto Rican, so if we go to the legislation here, I am a scientist, I am from San Juan, and this is how it affects me. But it does not only affect me, it affects my community. So I come with this information so you can take an informed decision when you take that vote for that legislation. And we hope that you take this action because this is the action that will benefit the community based on the research. So that's what we do here at PeersPen, and we follow up. We just follow up and maintain that relationship, and we put ourselves to service. So, hey, if you have a question regarding this legislation that just came up, we have an astronomer, as I just said, or we have agricultural scientists here in the group. So we do have several scientists that can actually bring their expertise to service.
That's great. Follow-up is so important. And even though we're all virtual and we get a million emails, it's really important to always send that email and to have that follow-up. And I wonder if, Vanessa, if you could talk about a little bit about saying, I don't know. So in my case, you know, all through high school, middle school, college, there was always a right answer, right? And then I went to graduate school and I was figuring out what we don't know. And so I don't know was a very, you know, reasonable response. Well, maybe in the STEM world that feels okay because we understand that we're kind of reaching the boundaries of knowledge. But how does that relate to when you're talking to legislators who are already pressed for time, they only can read a one-pager? How do you really have that I don't know conversation, but still feel like you are coming off as a credible, as an expert, and that you still have that trust that Flavia was just talking about?
That's a really good question. And I think in the, since I'm a social scientist, I feel like there's a lot of I don't knows. You know, we think we don't really know. I mean, that's, we always are saying that, or, you know, there's this level of certainty, which we have to describe what that actually means to the elected officials that we're speaking with, that it's hard to always be able to present something and say that, you know, we know to a certain extent, but we don't know, like the, you know, capital T truth, right? That's a lot harder in social science. And recently we did a statewide poll, and part of it was a representative sample across the state of Idaho. And the state house and the governor was really interested in how people had experienced COVID-19, what they felt about a potential mask mandate, how they felt about getting a vaccine. And we did this polling in November, and it was prior to the release of any of the vaccines for public vaccinations. And people were very skeptical. It was at 54% of Idahoans said they'd get the vaccine, which we know is not enough to you know, get where we need to get as far as immunity goes. There was a really huge difference in people that would support a mask mandate and those that would not. And at one point in time, the governor asked, you know, what do you think we should do? Which I don't like being in that position, because again, I'm trying to be this, you know, not an issue advocate, but I said, it's really hard. You're in a really tough place right now, you know, and I went through some different, you know, if you make this policy decision, then, you know, this is likely going to be the reaction, right? When we look at the numbers, we know that this group of people are going to be really opposed to something. But we did talk about, when it came to how can we increase the numbers of people that are willing to get the vaccine, we did start talking about who are those people from the data that we collected that we could have communication with and help them understand what was going on. Because we asked if they would get it, and then we asked why they would not, if they said they would not. And the two biggest things that people said were responses were that they didn't know about the efficacy of the vaccine. And again, this is before it was really out, and they were concerned about side effects. And then there were also people who said they just don't think they need it. And I can't remember what the fourth one was, but we knew that with time, the efficacy question and the side effect question could be addressed, because as people start to see their neighbors getting it and their neighbors feeling more secure and not having really super adverse side effects, and we're seeing that the spread slows down, then we're going to see more people start getting the vaccine and signing up. And so they developed a strategy to knowing who the state mandated that would get it first. They developed a strategy then to communicate the results and what the consequences were across those communities, and help the communities communicate themselves. So how can you work with religious organizations, for example, and speak, have people empowered to speak about they got the vaccine, they're feeling good about it, and people should go get the vaccine, almost helping people empower the community to speak on behalf of it too.
It's really good to know, because I feel that sometimes the I don't know question can be hard to address. And then people maybe don't want to say things because they feel like they lose some of their credibility. And as I think we've all learned, our health is such an important thing. And we don't always want to maybe get involved in something that we maybe don't know what the end is. And I wonder, Flo, if you could talk a little bit about public health in general, and just how how COVID has changed public health, and how are people who maybe don't have their background in public health, what can they do to partner with organizations like yourself to really help spread the word, help to, really increase the science of it, and what they can do as scientists in the public health field?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the first thing I would say is that, we talked a lot about and I'm not saying here, but just in general, about the 2008 recession and the impact that it had on a lot of our public sectors. And I don't think the conversation has been, detailed enough, because public health never recovered. It was one of the sectors that never recovered after 2008. So if you think about, all the other sectors having had some level of recovery and getting back to sort of their baseline operations, and public health not, then you layer a pandemic on top of that, and our infrastructure was just tapped. I can speak much more locally here in California, just the way that, a lot of our public health labs had not been refunded. And so here we are needing to, increase our testing capacity in the early days of this pandemic, and not having the physical infrastructure and staff to be able to ramp that up. And I also like to remind people that, yes, this pandemic has killed, an additional 500,000 people at this point, but people still are experiencing, heart attacks and strokes and, and complications for diabetes and car accidents and all of the other things that, that our medical community and our public health community are actively involved in. And so we also can't stop those activities, especially because we know for the chronic conditions, the way that they dovetail, together in terms of creating the enhanced risk of very severe disease for people who contract COVID. So this has been a challenging time for our public health workers. I'm sure we've seen the headlines of, some of them stepping down, and a lot of that has had to do with the confluence of politics and their role as public health professionals, and how they felt that, their jobs and their ability to do their jobs had been hampered because of political considerations, which is something that has happened in the past, but it's been a while since it's been so heavily politicized in this way. And there's been such, great outrage about these things. So the first thing I would say is, I think if you're a person who supports the role that public health is trying to play, reach out and say so. Be vocal about that too, because the people who are coming at them and who are opposing are incredibly vocal. And so if you know the science on mask wearing, and you see that it's coming up in your local, community to change the ordinances or to reopen this or to do these things, show up and say, here's what we know. Even if you don't want to be the person who tells them what to do, present the data that you have, right? Play those roles that Dr. Fry was talking about to the maximum capacity you can, and think about where you fit in. So that's one place I would say. The other is, and I know sometimes this is unpopular, but we have to get involved in budget. we have to be really clear because the budgets make such a big difference. And I can't speak to what's been happening elsewhere, but here in California, we had several communities that received coronavirus relief funds through the CARES Act and instead spent most of those funds on law enforcement. The county I live in is one of them. Sacramento County spent 85% of its $181 million on the sheriff's department and on probation. And public health had to literally scrape to get under $2 million out of 181. And those dollars weren't spent on, protecting our small businesses or housing support. We have over 100,000 people in our region who are at risk of being displaced if the eviction protections go away. None of those funds were spent on that. They were spent on law enforcement. And so I know that sometimes that feels like you're touching the third rail of politics, getting into how much funding goes to police and sheriffs and all of that. But the bottom line is it impacts our health. Because as we, and I could even show the slide, as we waited, as those funds weren't spent and they were spent on other things, our case rate kept going up. And we potentially could have done something about it if our public health force had gotten the, something like $60 to $90 million they'd asked for, instead of having to scrape to barely get 2 million. And from what I'm hearing, we weren't the only ones that spent our monies in that way. And so I think it is really important that we pay attention to and that we're really clear on where we want dollars to go, because when we don't invest in prevention, we often end up being in a worse position and having to dig ourselves out of a hole. So I would say those are the best things you can do for public health, is really look at the budgets and begin to say, here are some things I think we need to spend these dollars on, both in pandemic times and in non-pandemic times, because part of the reason that we didn't recover from the 2008 recession is because we didn't have a dedicated advocacy force. We don't have the equivalent of, the unions that represent firefighters and police officers and others coming together and saying, we need more money for this. We need to pass a special tax to be able to, recover revenue. We didn't have any of that in public health. And ultimately we suffered. And right now the entire, country is suffering because of cuts, even at the national level, that were never recovered during the recession and even in times prior to that.
That is so true. And I think at ESOL, we are always saying that we may be scientists, we may be engineers, but we're also citizens. And so we really have a duty to vote. We have a duty to be part of boards and commissions. We have a duty to speak up and really advocate not only for our science policies, but also just for policies that will create a just, world and community. We have a question from the audience, and I'm wondering as we wrap up, if all three of you could just briefly touch on, in the question they said, are there advocacy groups that are similar to what you're talking about in California? And I wonder if you could all just maybe talk about either working with advocacy groups or just maybe some really simple ideas for people with STEM backgrounds to actually really kind of take that first step to getting involved. So Flavia, if you want to start with that.
Yes, so at first I got involved because I got involved with an organization. So I was very interested in science policy, but I had no idea what I had to do. I didn't even know what the policy making steps were. So I joined a nonprofit organization, and I just learned about the policy making decisions. How could I help? And so in the conferences, in the national conferences, usually they do have groups or socials for people interested in science advocacy. And that's a very good place to start networking and start to learn about how can you get involved in science policy. So with PeerSpan, I got involved with PeerSpan, and that's how I got into science policy. That's how I got to understand how policy was making, how do you do policy making, how can you get involved in policy making. And usually within our networks, if you reach out, someone in your network will definitely know how to get to an organization. Union for Concerned Scientists was another resource that I looked at first, and I looked several webinars that they had, blogs, and so that's how I got involved in science policy as a scientist with no idea as to how I could get involved, and that I could actually get involved in the policy making decisions in the local government.
Great, thank you, Flavia. Vanessa, if you want to chime in with your one or two suggestions.
Definitely. So just as Flavia said, who are those colleagues of yours or other people out there that are taking initiative? And I think it's really important to understand the policymaking process, which is, you know, a touch different across jurisdictions, right? You know, some states have a full-time legislature. Ours is part-time, so they only meet a couple months a year, right? So when can you engage? And then how are groups already engaging? There's very likely a lobbyist that's working on an issue that you're interested in. I think it's always good to meet with them. And I do that more for an understanding. I really, again, as someone that's more of like an honest broker, I want to understand both sides. And so I'll talk with the issue advocates, the advocacy coalitions is what we call them, that are really working towards a particular area. But then I'm really interested in the groups that are really against the particular coalition, because I feel like in order to understand how to dismantle a problem, you kind of have to know how it's built and what is the true, whether it's fear or concern behind changing. So, but I do think that there are, you know, on all the states that I work, groups that are really committed to engaging with people at the state house or locally. And I think finding those, I don't have like a really, here's an I don't know. I don't have a really specific resource. But I mean, I think that this organization is one that, I mean, I didn't even know about it until I had been in contact with you all, and I'm really excited to engage, right? So I think it's through this type of, when you see these opportunities, to really engage with them and then pass this opportunity along to your colleagues, right? And Flo just posted a resource, I think, too. You know, look and see what other places are doing and see, is there a model out there that you can help support and follow or maybe launch?
Great, thank you. And yeah, Flo, if you want to quickly just talk about the resources you dropped or anything else that you have as a suggestion.
Sure. Yeah. So first and foremost, my organization, Public Health Advocates, has funding from all of the major health foundations across the state of California, because we, the irony of this is that Assemblymember Jim Wood said last year, you know, the reason why we haven't invested more in public health infrastructure is because public health doesn't have an advocacy group. And we said, haha, but also ouch, because our name is literally Public Health Advocates. But we also were certainly understanding what he was saying in terms of like, that's not the role we've played, right? We've always done the, you know, the systems change work and not necessarily advocating for specific public health infrastructure. And so we said, you know, it's a good opportunity for us to be able to step in and align a lot of the initiatives we already had around policy to be able to do this work. And so we have a steering committee that has now met twice, and we're officially launching the initiative. And so there's going to be ways for those of you who are in California to be able to participate in that and to join up. So I would encourage you to go to our website and sign up to be part of our outreach group, because we'll be sending out notifications as soon as, you know, Thursday of this week about how you can get involved and what the next steps are and what policies we're tracking and what budget items we're tracking at the state level and how you can be involved in that. And also, because I mentioned the budget, there's a lot of really great grassroots advocacy that is having a really remarkable impact, not just on how budgets are spent, but also how we go about budgeting, because I think it's one of the places where there's not a lot of input, in part because numbers and money scare a lot of us. And so these great resources across the country have been coming together and trying to get more people involved. I am a member of the People's Budget Sacramento. And so part of what we're trying to do is get the incorporated cities as well as the county of Sacramento to do a better job of being transparent about what the budget is, what they're thinking about as priorities. And we also have an annual survey that we're using to be able to help to explain to our county supervisors, and it's in 17 languages, what people in the community are actually being impacted by and how they'd like those dollars to be spent. And so, we started People's Budget last year, really recognizing it was kind of in the midst of that CARES Act crisis, and recognizing that this budgeting runs really deep and we need to do something about it. We're modeled after some of the other models that I shared some of the lists of websites there. I would strongly encourage you to start it up. Get a group of people together who are interested in doing this and saying how, and use the models. We're always happy. We had a conversation with Hawaii recently and several other folks who have Colorado, I think, has been interested in how you can do this, because there's so many issues that need our advocacy, especially when it comes to the budget. And it's a great way to begin to organize around that and engage lots of people across the community. So I'd strongly encourage you to consider that if your community doesn't have something already going. And then I saw saw that somebody mentioned in the comments as well, joining boards and commissions. So I actually sit as the chair of one of our local tax commissions. And I do that because I'm really trying to, once again, make sure that the money is spent in accordance with the way that the tax was written, because it's a regressive tax, which means our low income, folks in the community are spending more proportionally of their dollars to support that. And so I want to make sure that the way that it's spent also is disproportionate in those communities, because we know what the impact has been. And so I think there are lots of ways that you can get involved in your local city and county and state boards and commissions to be able to lend your leadership as well. And those places are as effective as you are. So sometimes we think about, well, I don't have official decision-making capacity, we're only recommenders. Well, then recommend as hard as you can, right? Again, go to your media, really take your scope of work and operate at the top of it and not at the bottom, because you'd be surprised how much noise you can make without actually having any official decision-making capacity, and how much you can push organizations to do something differently and to think about things differently.
Thank you, Flo. That was really great. I hadn't thought about budgets the way that you had, so that was really good. And thank you to all our panelists for sharing your advice. I know I learned a lot. I hope all our attendees learned a lot. And thank you for all tuning into our COVID conversations all about science communication. So I hope that you now feel equipped and empowered to have those conversations with family, friends, and with your local government. And so when you are done, when you exit out of this webinar, you're going to receive a small survey. And so please, if you can, fill it out so we can create more content and webinars for you that fit with what you want and what your needs are. And so for that, I thank all the panelists, I thank all the attendees, and thank you all for coming here today. Thank you.